monuments of ancient Egypt dominate her desert landscape. They remind the world of the fabulous power and wealth of a civilization that flourished thousands of years before the birth of Christ. Two obsessed treasure seekers would devote their lives to uncovering the secrets buried beneath the sand. One was a circus strongman. The other, a stubborn English archaeologist. Their unmatched passion would bring Egypt's past to life. It is 1816. A 7-ton stone head lies face up in the burning Egyptian desert. It's been there for over 3,000 years. Now it's under the scrutiny of a tall, strange Italian dressed like an Arab. His name is Giovanni Belzoni. The greatest treasure seeker of his time, he has staked his reputation on transporting the Colossus to Europe. If he fails, he will be penniless in a strange and exotic land. His whole life is in the balance, and it's been quite a life. Born in Padua in 1778, Belzoni showed an early enthusiasm for mechanics. His father recognized his talent and placed him in a monastery, where he studied engineering. But soon his tranquil world was shattered. Napoleon's army swept through Italy and closed many of the monasteries.
The sudden entry of the French army altered the course of my education, and being destined to travel, I have been a wanderer ever since.
"6'6", immense by the standards of the day, Belzoni became a circus strongman. In England, Belzoni became a star. The crowds dubbed him the Patagonian Samson and the Italian Hercules. But Belzoni wanted a different kind of recognition. Following his passion for adventure and engineering, Belzoni voyaged to Egypt with a scheme to sell water pumps to irrigate the desert. The pump idea was a disaster and failed. But Belzoni fell passionately in love with Cairo.
It was a place European visitors found completely exotic and romantic. Altogether a place for adventure, discovery, and experiment.
In Cairo, Belzoni reinvented himself. He began to dress like an Arab and grew his beard. But he had to make a living. All around him, the French and English were competing to find treasure for their national museums. The hunt for antiquities in Egypt was fast becoming a gold rush. Belzoni seized the opportunity. He heard tales of a colossal stone head ready for the taking. It was 400 miles south along the Nile in Thebes. Always persuasive, Belzoni soon had the British paying for a trip to collect the head and any other treasure he could find. The land he was entering was lawless and largely unexplored. Virgin territory for a treasure seeker. Arriving in Thebes, the ancient capital, Belzoni was awestruck.
It appeared to me like entering a city of giants, who after a long conflict were all destroyed, leaving the ruins of their various temples as the only proofs of their former existence. Even their language and writing are totally unknown to us.
He arrived at a time when the monuments had hardly been touched by anybody. And here he was with a veritable gold mine in front of him. There were so many statues, so many reliefs, so many things that were detached and loose. I mean, he was in a situation where he could practically pick and choose what he wanted to take away. And nobody much cared.
Except the other Europeans competing for the same treasure. The most formidable of the collectors was Bernardino Drovetti, the French ambassador. He had spies everywhere.
He was already informed that I had undertaken to remove the colossal bust.
Belzoni had to stake his claim immediately.
I found it with its face upwards, apparently smiling on me at the thoughts of being taken to England. I must say that my expectations were exceeded by its beauty.
Belzoni hired the inhabitants of a nearby village, Kurna. His generous wages lured them away from their usual profession, tomb robbing. Their new job was to help Belzoni move the Colossus, a task they thought impossible. When the head moved for the first time, the villagers let out a great shout.
Moving this many-ton piece of stone was such an accomplishment at the time that it's almost unbelievable. He had to have it dragged about 2.5 miles from its site.
Belzoni was quick to credit his workers.
The hard task they had to drag such a weight, with the extreme heat and dust, it was more than any European could have withstood.
Belzoni sketched the progress of the head 200 yards a day. Ever the showman, he drew the Colossus even larger than it really was. Belzoni was creating a legend from his own life. Then one morning, no workers showed up. Drovetti, the French ambassador, had bribed the village chief to call the workers off. He wanted to stop Belzoni at any cost. Belzoni burst into the chief's house.
He attempted to put his hands on me, which I resisted. He then became more violent and drew his sword. I instantly seized and disarmed him, placed my hands on his stomach, and made him sensible of my superiority, at least in point of strength, by keeping him firm in the corner of the room.
The next day, the Colossus was moving again. In 2.5 weeks, it was by the side of the Nile, ready to ship to England. But Belzoni's first great success had made Drovetti his lifelong enemy. Hearing stories of more treasure, Belzoni voyaged further up the Nile. After 2.5 weeks, his little boat reached the village of Abu Simbel. Peeping out from the sand were the heads of 4 colossal statues.
The amazing accumulation of sand was such that it appeared an impossibility ever to reach the door.
They labored literally with buckets to dig through the sand to get into this monumental structure. And imagine the wonderful sense of adventure, the glee of walking into an ancient monument, particularly something as stupendous as Abu Simbel, for the first time. The very first time that a Westerner had ever had this experience.
Speechless, Belzoni wandered through the temple cut out of the cliff itself. If he could have read the hieroglyphs, Belzoni would have known that Abu Simbel celebrates the greatest pharaoh of ancient Egypt. Ramses II ruled for 66 years and sired over 90 children. Towering over the landscape is the gargantuan image of Ramses himself, 67 feet tall. Even Belzoni realized this was one prize he had to leave behind. But back in Thebes, it was a very different story. Belzoni bought relic after relic from his friends in the village of Kurna to add to his collection. Belzoni now had one of the biggest loads of treasure Egypt had ever seen, and it was destined for England. Even today, the young Memnon remains one of the great prizes of the British Museum. Belzoni had found his calling. Even though no one had yet invented the name, Belzoni was becoming one of the world's first archaeologists.
Belzoni was developing a whole repertoire of what we would now consider typical archaeological traits. He was observing, he was recording. I can't say that he was restoring in quite the sense that we would today, but he was acquiring for museums where things would be preserved. And some of his records, his tracings of reliefs in temples, for instance, and in tombs, are the only record we have of some things that have either been changed or damaged.
As soon as possible, Belzoni hurried back to Thebes. Again, he was not shy about his phenomenal success.
I accumulated articles enough to fill another boat, as large as that of the preceding year.
Drovetti could not get away from Belzoni's accomplishments. Wherever the Italian strongman collected, he left his signature. It was almost like a taunt. Desperate, Drovetti used his political connections to ban Belzoni from excavating among the temples. And through his local agents, he even threatened Belzoni's life. To avoid confrontation, Belzoni crossed the Nile. He was moving to the West Bank, the ancient realm of the dead. Seeking new sources of treasure, he passed over a low range of desert hills. Belzoni was entering one of ancient Egypt's most holy places, the Valley of the Kings. For over 500 years, the pharaohs were buried here. Mummified in a ritual lasting 70 days, Egypt's rulers believed that by preserving their body intact and keeping their name remembered, they could be immortal.
The Egyptians are often described as a people obsessed with death, gloomy in the extreme. This is not so. In fact, the Egyptians were entranced by life and wished to continue life beyond this world and into the next. This is why they carried with them into the tomb essentially the contents of their home. The tomb was the home for the next world.
The Valley of the Kings was dotted with tombs that had been plundered before the birth of Christ. Even the grave robbers of Kurna thought there was nothing left to discover. Belzoni disagreed.
Belzoni certainly did have a natural ability. He was able to read a landscape. He saw almost instinctively where the Egyptians were likely to have quarried tombs, and so he dug those spots.
In just 8 days, Belzoni did the unimaginable. He discovered 2 royal tombs. The contents had been looted, and the paintings were
in good preservation, but not in the best style.
Belzoni had a hunch there were even more beautiful tombs hidden in the valley. He intended to find them. Belzoni, the treasure seeker, was fast becoming a connoisseur. Belzoni's next move was to follow a gully where rainwater ran into the ground. His workers, experienced tomb robbers, thought he was crazy. Why would anyone want to be buried near an underground stream? But in a few days, they opened up Belzoni's greatest discovery, the largest and most beautiful tomb in the Valley of the Kings.
I may call this a fortunate day. I do not mean to say that fortune has made me rich, for I do not consider all rich men fortunate. But she has given me that satisfaction, that extreme pleasure which wealth cannot purchase. The pleasure of discovering what has long been sought in vain, and of presenting the world with a new and perfect monument of Egyptian antiquity.
Belzoni could only gaze in wonder. A mere 5 years later, in 1822, the hieroglyphs would be translated, and visitors would know they were in the tomb of Sethos I, who ruled Egypt at the height of its power. The tomb reflected his glory. Nephthys, with outstretched wings, guards the body of the pharaoh. A procession of boats sails across the waters of the underworld to greet the newly arrived king. On the ceiling are all the important gods. They cluster around the constellations of the northern sky, represented as animals, to allow Sethos' soul to pass up into heaven. As Belzoni returned to Cairo, he should have been triumphant. Instead, he was furious.
At this time, I received several journals from Europe and found, to my great surprise, that all my former discoveries and labors had been published in the names of other people, while mine was not even mentioned.
Still, Belzoni was not about to let his dream of fame slip away. He resolved to prove himself a legitimate scholar and focused on a puzzle that had baffled thinkers for 3,000 years. The location of the entrance to the second largest pyramid, the tomb of the pharaoh Chephren. Bypassing false turns and granite barriers, Belzoni explored the passageways to find a huge burial chamber. He was the first man to stand there in 2 millennia. This time, Belzoni wanted to be sure everyone realized who was responsible for the discovery. He left his signature in letters 3 feet high. It was an audacious act, but one that even today's top Egyptian archaeologist can forgive.
Like when he entered inside the second pyramid, and he wrote his name and the year 1818, it became a part of the monument. It shows us the story of Belzoni. He was a man that wanted to be remembered, and he is remembered.
When Belzoni returned to Thebes, he thought his rivalry with Drovetti had died down, but news of his success at the pyramids had preceded him.
I was warned by an Arab not to go where the other Europeans were, but I took no notice of what he said, as sometimes those people make much out of nothing.
This time the Egyptian was right. Drovetti's agents were waiting to ambush the Italian giant. A gun was being raised when Belzoni's friends, the villagers of Kurna, intervened, shielding him from certain death. The tomb robbers had come to his rescue. Belzoni knew it was time to leave.
I felt no small degree of sorrow to quit a place which was become so familiar to me. I felt more in leaving Thebes than any other place in my life.
Belzoni returned to London. There he would show everyone who was the greatest treasure seeker in Egypt. Relying on his circus instinct for self-promotion, Belzoni devoted himself to an account of his adventures and prepared an exhibition. The book came out within a year. It was an instant success. The exhibit opened a year later at the aptly named Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly. It was a sensation. Belzoni had created the only concrete, three-dimensional experience that people could have of the tombs and pyramids of Egypt. It featured exact reproductions of the 2 most spectacular rooms in the tomb of Sethos. An explanation of the entrance to the pyramid of Chephren, and drawings of Abu Simbel. In 5 years, Belzoni had accomplished more in Egypt than any other explorer before or since. He had filled the Egyptian Hall of the British Museum. He was surrounded by scholars eager for his opinions and insights. A year later, exploring deep in Africa, he was cut down by disease. Only 44, Belzoni died at the height of his success. But his reputation would live on. In 1922, exactly a century later, a 47-year-old English excavator, Howard Carter, broods in the Egyptian night. One day he will be the world's most famous archaeologist. But now, the dreams of a lifetime are crashing down around him. To cheer himself up, he ponders his favorite book, Belzoni's account of his adventures and discoveries in Egypt.
Those were the great days of excavating. Anything to which a fancy was taken was just appropriated. And if there was a difference in opinion with a brother excavator, one laid for him with a gun.
Carter's fascination with Egypt began as a child. Under the tutelage of his father, an illustrator, he spent hours sketching in the Egyptian collection of a nearby estate and dreamt of traveling to the land of the pharaohs. In 1891, when Carter was 17, his father made his dream come true and helped get him a job in Egypt, copying ancient wall paintings.
Carter never had any kind of formal education when he was young, and he was not someone who could compete easily with other people working in the archaeological field in Egypt, most of whom had been to good private schools and to one of the better universities. I wouldn't call him a rough diamond, but somebody called him a Norfolk dumpling.
Although he was rough around the edges socially, Carter brought a new level of skill to the vital task of recording Egyptian art. He attracted immediate attention and soon landed a position with a founder of modern archaeology, the great Flinders Petrie.
Petrie's training transformed me into an investigator, teaching me to dig and examine systematically.
In 1892, Petrie handed Carter a telegram. His beloved father, Samuel, had died.
It was in my father's studio, and largely under his tuition, I received my early training. We parted in Victoria Station, whence I left for Egypt. With kindly admonitions and a last farewell, he gave me permission to smoke and presented a tin of suitable tobacco, together with a number of packets of cigarette papers, as the train slowly rolled away.
His father was the one who had opened his horizons, arranged for him to be in Egypt. Alone at night, Carter shared his pain with no one. Carter escaped into his work. He moved on to Der el-Bahri, the mortuary temple of the most famous woman pharaoh, Hatshepsut. The project rebuilt the temple from a pile of rubble. Carter was the principal artist.
Artistically, the site was a continual joy. I learnt more of Egyptian art, its serene simplicity, than in any other time or place.
But Carter had a new dream.
Due to Petrie's training, my great desire is to be an excavator.
Eager to add to his skills, Carter took on other responsibilities. It wasn't long before his talents were noticed by other excavators.
It is certainly quite remarkable how well the difficult work of rebuilding is done by Mr. Carter. Besides, he has a thorough command of Arabic. He can direct and superintend the men, or rather teach them what they are to do.
Carter was fast establishing his reputation. But there was one thing he would never be in the eyes of British archaeologists: a gentleman.
Carter's manners continue to be much as they were. He doesn't hesitate to pick his last hollow tooth with a match during dinner and help himself to whiskey in an absent-minded fashion, emptying half the bottle into his tumbler, then laugh and say he wasn't thinking.
To the surprise of many, in 1899, Carter was offered the job of protecting all the monuments in southern Egypt. His ability and dedication had triumphed over his humble origins. Carter was on his way, and he was only 25.
Carter became chief inspector very early in his career. He was very young. He took to it like a duck to water. He was very organized, very energetic, very active, and really a very good thing for Egyptology at that time.
Riding his horse Sultan from site to site, Carter was finally happy. The very best part of Carter's new job was that he finally had the chance to excavate on his own. Supervising digs in the Valley of the Kings, he used instinct and an eye for detail to open a variety of tombs. Carter also knew the best place to look for treasure wasn't necessarily in the desert. In the local coffee shops, he gossiped with the tomb robbers of Kurna.
I must admit this practice was liable to serious criticism. Some colleagues in the government service frowned upon it as a bad habit. They thought it degrading.
But Carter's time was well spent. He was keeping track of the local market and stolen relics, and he enjoyed himself. Carter had a genuine respect for his friends, the grave robbers, and it extended back to their ancient predecessors.
One can imagine the scramble through a small hole into the burial chamber. The hectic search by a glimmering light for treasure that was portable. How inevitable it all was. The temptation was just too great. Wealth beyond the dreams of avarice lay there, and sooner or later, the tomb robber was bound to win through.
Carter was beginning to come into his own. Then, in 1905, once again, his happy world was shattered. Drunk, a group of French tourists broke into the Antiquities Service headquarters at the pyramids of Saqqara. Words were exchanged, and one of the Egyptian guards was punched. The French smashed up the furniture and attacked the Egyptians with sticks. Carter didn't hesitate. He ordered the Egyptians to defend themselves and joined the struggle. But Carter had violated a sacred colonial taboo, and the French demanded an apology.
He was a stubborn man who was quite unwilling to bend his attitudes in this respect towards what you might call the diplomatic necessities of the moment. He was not prepared to apologize because he did not think that he had done anything wrong. Well, he had done something wrong. He had allowed his workmen to raise their arms against foreigners, and that was an unforgivable sin at that time in Egypt.
Carter was forced to resign and went back up the Nile to Thebes.
I feel the humiliation to an exceeding extent. The treatment I have received after I have carried out my duty is inconceivable.
For 3 years, Carter could only eke out a living, working as a guide and painting watercolors to sell to passing tourists. An acquaintance even sketched Carter as a tramp. His fortunes were at their lowest ebb, when quite unexpectedly, he was befriended by the man who would transform his life, Lord Carnarvon. Carnarvon loved horse racing and motor cars, and he had more money than a pharaoh. He had come to Egypt to recuperate from a terrible automobile accident. Soon bored, he took up excavating. His first year produced a mummified cat and little else. Undeterred, he sought an expert to help him and was introduced to Carter. It was the beginning of a deep friendship.
An extraordinary friendship, you might think, because they came from opposite ends of the social spectrum. But it seemed to work. They were both loners, they both had a passionate interest in Egyptology, and they hit it off. They obviously had a lot in common.
Carnarvon believed in luxury, and Carter soon developed a taste for fine wine to go along with the salmon, tongue, curried fowl, and other delicacies Carnarvon ordered from London. Carter started to dress like his patron. He even used the same cigarette holder. In 1910, bankrolled by Carnarvon, Carter built himself a house in the desert near Thebes. He called it Castle Carter. Carnarvon's financial backing was a bet on Carter's intuition. Carter believed that somewhere in the Valley of the Kings there was the unopened royal tomb of a pharaoh. There were hints, but no sure proof that he ever existed. His name was Tutankamen. In 1914, World War I broke out. Carter joined British intelligence in Cairo. Not part of the upper-class elite, he was relegated to tedious office routine. After 3 years, he was allowed to return to Castle Carter and his life's work, finding the elusive Tutankamen. Carnarvon had already obtained the exclusive permit to excavate in the Valley of the Kings. Carter began by drawing a detailed map of the valley. Most archaeologists thought he was crazy. They said there were no tombs left in the Valley of the Kings. But Carter never revealed the slightest doubt.
I suggested to Lord Carnarvon that we take as a starting point the triangle of ground defined by the tombs of Ramses II, Meremptah, and Ramses VI, the area in which we hoped the tomb of Tutankhamun might be situated. Mountains of rubbish thrown out by previous excavators encumbered the ground in all directions. Clearly, the only satisfactory thing to do was to dig systematically right down to bedrock. It was rather a desperate undertaking.
After a year of digging, 100 men moving massive amounts of rubble, all that Carter uncovered were 2 small pottery fragments. The excavations continued, unearthing nothing. Carter was sure Tutankamen was there somewhere. But how long would Carnarvon finance excavations with no results? In 1920, Carter turned up 13 jars. It wasn't much of a find. More excavations just moved stone from one part of the desert to another. The digging had gone on for 6 years. Carnarvon summoned Carter to his office at Highclere Castle. It was the moment Carter had been dreading. The excavations were over. Once again, maybe for the last time, Carter brought out the map. The triangle Carter had originally laid out was inked in. It had all been excavated, except for one small area near the tomb of Ramses VI. Carter proposed a desperate bargain. He would personally pay for the excavation of this untouched place if Carnarvon would keep the permit to dig. Carnarvon, a sporting man, accepted Carter's offer, but insisted on paying for the work himself. When he returned to Egypt, Carter told his friends he had found a companion to share his life. Rumors spread that he was getting married, but the companion was a canary he had brought in England. His servants were sure the pet was a good omen.
Mabruk, it's a bird of gold that will bring luck. This year we will find, inshallah, a tomb full of gold.
The workers realized this was the last chance. Even the water boy, the lowest-ranking member of the team, got in on the act. He poked around with a stick and was astonished to find a limestone step buried under the sand. The news was telegraphed to Carnarvon, who left for Egypt at once. 2 days of furious digging had revealed steps leading down to a sealed doorway. The Egyptian workers called it the Tomb of the Bird.
At last have made wonderful discovery in valley, a magnificent tomb with seals intact.
2.5 weeks later, on November 26, 1922, Carter chipped a hole through the wall concealing the tomb.
I was struck dumb with amazement. And when Lord Carnarvon, unable to stand the suspense any longer, inquired anxiously, "Can you see anything?" It was all I could do to get out the words, "Yes, wonderful things." As my eyes grew accustomed to the light, details of the room within emerged slowly from the mist. Strange animals, statues, and gold. Everywhere, the glint of gold.
The discovery sparked a media frenzy. Visitors flocked to the Valley of the Kings from all over the world.
A kind of madness overtook people, and it was to a very great extent whipped up by the press. What you had there was a discovery of a kind that had never been made before. A royal tomb, a tomb of almost a child king. It was full of things made of gold. There was the possibility of a curse. There was everything there to stimulate not only the connoisseur, but also the crazy.
An abundance of gold treasure helped create Tutmania. But the world's imagination was also captivated by the story of Carter and Carnarvon's heroic persistence, as well as the touching portrait of Tutankamen the tomb revealed. The Golden Throne is decorated not with a scene of triumph in war, but with the 16-year-old pharaoh being lovingly caressed by his equally young wife, Ankhesenamun. On a golden shrine, Tutankhamun pours wine into his wife's hands next to an image of her, gently fastening a necklace around his neck. Carter was moved almost to tears.
These are charming scenes and full of kindliness, which it pleases us to consider modern.
Even the wall paintings surrounding the sarcophagus are simple and intimate. They show the innocent young king being welcomed to the next world. Carter had brought an ancient pharaoh to life. King Tut had become as familiar as the boy next door.
Nobody has ever found anything to match Tutankhamun, either in Egypt or anywhere in the world. It's simply the greatest archaeological discovery that's ever been made.
Clearing the tomb was a huge task that would ultimately take 10 years of Carter's life. Although he had an all-star team of archaeologists to help him, Carter labored ceaselessly.
All the pressure in the end came down to Carter. He was the director of the excavation, the excavator, the artist. He controlled everything. Carnarvon had ceased to participate in the actual work of the excavation, but he was interfering all the time, and he brought these important people to see the excavation. They interrupted, they got in the way, and Carnarvon exploited the situation in a way that Carter really could no longer abide.
By 1923, the men were no longer speaking to each other. To try and reconcile, Carnarvon stopped by Castle Carter. Carter refused to let him in. Carnarvon was devastated. He wrote Carter a letter.
I've done many foolish things, and I'm very sorry. I suppose the fuss and worry have affected me. I'm a man with few friends, and whatever happens, nothing will ever alter my feelings for you. I should like to have a good talk.
A few weeks later, Carnarvon cut open a mosquito bite while shaving, and it became infected. Always in delicate health, he lapsed into delirium. Carter went to see him, but no one knows if he and Carnarvon had their talk.
April the 5th, 1923. Poor Lord C died during the early hours of the morning.
Immediately, Carnarvon's death was attributed to the curse of the pharaoh. Carter had no time for such speculation.
All sane people should dismiss such inventions with contempt.
If there was a curse of the pharaohs, I think perhaps it was granting to Howard Carter his greatest wish, which was to discover Tutankhamun. Because once he'd found Tutankhamun, once that dream had been realized, there was nothing. There was nothing left for him.
Carter became a world celebrity, but was never able to write the academic study that would secure his place among Egyptologists. An old, sick man, he sat on the porch of a hotel in Luxor and drank alone. Occasionally, a passing tourist would join him. By early 1939, in failing health, he had left Castle Carter for the last time. On March 2nd, Howard Carter died. Only one of his colleagues came to the funeral. The inscription on his gravestone read simply, Howard Carter, archaeologist and Egyptologist. But perhaps his epitaph should have been what was written on a small wishing cup Carter discovered in Tutankhamen's tomb.
May your spirit live. May you spend millions of years, you who love Thebes, sitting with your face to the north wind, your eyes beholding happiness.